The cigarette smoke hung heavy in the humid Tokyo air on that fateful September evening in 1940. Outside the Prime Minister's official residence, the sounds of a nation preparing for war echoed through the streets, military trucks rumbling past, soldiers marching in formation, the distant hum of aircraft engines from nearby airfields. Inside, in a room thick with tension and tobacco smoke, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stubbed out his third Lucky Strike cigarette of the evening, the American tobacco, a bitter irony that escaped no one present. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Kono had cut through the usual elaborate courtesies of Japanese diplomatic protocol with a question that would echo through history. His words hung in the air like the smoke from Yamamoto's American cigarettes. "If we go to war with America, Admiral, what are our chances?" The other military officials in the room, generals whose uniforms glittered with medals from campaigns in Manchuria and China, leaned forward expectantly. They anticipated the confident assessment of Japan's premier naval strategist, the architect of their combined fleet. Instead, Yamamoto's response would haunt the Japanese empire until its dying breath. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of mathematical certainty rather than military bravado. "If I am told to fight, regardless of consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year. But I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken only by the soft scraping of chairs as the other officers shifted uneasily. Here was their commander-in-chief, the man who would have to lead any war against America, essentially predicting Japan's defeat before the first shot was fired. What those assembled officials could unfully grasp in that smoke-filled room was that Yamamoto wasn't merely speculating or offering a pessimistic assessment. He had witnessed something they had not, the true face of American industrial power. He had walked through its factories, studied its oil fields, calculated its production capabilities down to the last rivet and barrel. The mathematics of destruction had been computed years earlier in the hallowed halls of Harvard University, confirmed in the roaring blast furnaces of Pennsylvania's steel mills, and verified among the endless forest of oil derricks stretching across the Texas plains. This is a story about prophecy and tragedy, about a man who saw the future with terrifying clarity but was powerless to prevent it. It's the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese naval genius who spent years in America during the 1920s and returned home with knowledge that would make him the most reluctant architect of Pearl Harbor. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable tale of foresight and futility, take a moment to subscribe if you love exploring the hidden currents of history, and tell me in the comments what city you re-watching from. My love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts around the world. Yamamoto knew something his colleagues desperately wanted to ignore. Japan had already lost any war with America before it began. The only variable was time, 6 months. He had calculated with the precision of an engineer he would give them half a year of victories before the industrial colossus of America fully awakened from its peaceful slumber and turned its awesome manufacturing power toward total war. The tragedy of Yamamoto's story lies not just in his prescient understanding of America's capabilities, but in how that understanding was acquired. Unlike his peers, who knew America only through intelligence reports and diplomatic cables, Yamamoto had lived among Americans, studied their methods, observed their casual abundance of resources. He had experienced firsthand what Japan was preparing to challenge, not just a military force, but an entire civilization built upon seemingly limitless industrial capacity. Born Isoroku Takano on April 4, 1884, in the small city of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture, he entered the world as the 6th son of an impoverished schoolteacher. His father was 56 years old at his birth, leading to the unusual name Isoroku, which literally means 56 in Japanese. The family's poverty was crushing and formative. They often survived on sweet potatoes and barley, unable to afford rice, the staple food that defined Japanese civilization. This early experience of scarcity would later make Yamamoto's observations of American abundance all the more striking and significant. The Japan of Yamamoto's youth was a nation caught between worlds, having only recently emerged from centuries of feudal isolation. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had opened the country to Western influence and launched a desperate campaign of modernization. Young Japanese were sent abroad to study Western technology, military methods, and industrial techniques. The nation's survival seemed to depend on rapidly adopting the tools and methods of the very powers that had forced Japan from its isolation. In 1916, following Japanese custom for ambitious young men without family connections, the naval officer was adopted by the Yamamoto family, taking their name and their modest social standing. By then, he had already lost 2 fingers on his left hand at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where he served as a young officer and witnessed Japan's stunning naval victory over Russia's Baltic Fleet. That triumph had convinced many Japanese that their spiritual superiority, their unique Yamato spirit, could overcome any material disadvantage. It was a delusion that Yamamoto would spend the rest of his life trying to dispel among his countrymen. The victory at Tsushima became a cornerstone of Japanese military mythology, but Yamamoto understood what his contemporaries chose to ignore. Japan's success had been possible only because Russia was fighting a war thousands of miles from its industrial base, while simultaneously battling a revolution at home. The Tsar's forces were divided, demoralized, and operating at the end of impossibly long supply lines. America, by contrast, would face no such disadvantages in any Pacific conflict. Its industrial heartland would be safe from attack. Its supply lines would be measured in hundreds rather than thousands of miles, and its people would be united in righteous anger rather than divided by revolution. But to truly understand this fundamental difference, to grasp the full magnitude of what Japan would be challenging, Yamamoto needed to experience America directly. His first glimpse of this different world came in 1919, when, as a 35-year-old commander, he received orders that would change not just his life, but potentially the course of world history. Report to Harvard University for English Language Studies and observe American naval developments. What happened during those transformative years in America would make him both the most knowledgeable and the most pessimistic Japanese officer regarding any potential conflict with the United States. The man who would return to Japan would be fundamentally changed, Japanese patriot transformed into a modern Cassandra, prophesying doom that none would heed, armed with mathematical certainty about America's industrial supremacy, but powerless to convince his own government of the futility of challenging such overwhelming productive capacity. In April 1919, Yamamoto arrived at Harvard University, a striking figure amid the ivy-covered buildings of Cambridge. He carried 2 traditional Japanese swords and wore his naval uniform, drawing curious glances from American students who had never seen such an exotic visitor. Ostensibly, he was there as a special student to study English and observe American educational methods. His official transcript would later show a mediocre C+ in his language course, but this unremarkable grade completely obscured the real education taking place. Living in modest quarters in nearby Brookline, Massachusetts, Yamamoto established a routine that would have seemed obsessive to casual observers, but was actually a systematic intelligence-gathering operation of unprecedented scope. He slept only 3 to 4 hours nightly, spending the remaining time in what can only be described as a comprehensive study of American industrial capacity. His small room became cluttered with maps of oil fields, statistical abstracts of American manufacturing output, technical journals about steel production, and detailed analyses of transportation networks. While his fellow Japanese students, approximately 70 of them at Harvard, during his time there attended formal classes and social functions, Yamamoto spent countless hours in Harvard's Widener Library, one of the world's great repositories of technical and industrial knowledge. He researched petroleum geology with the intensity of a doctoral student, studying refining capacity, transportation methods, and production statistics. What he discovered should have ended any thought of war before it began. America produced 65% of the world's oil in 1919 alone, 378 million barrels in a single year. Japan, by stark contrast, had to import nearly every drop of petroleum it consumed, and most of that oil came from America itself. The mathematical implications were staggering and undeniable. Japan was planning to fight a war against a nation that controlled its very ability to wage that war. American oil-powered Japanese ships, planes, and vehicles. American steel built Japanese weapons. American machinery manufactured Japanese military equipment. In contemplating war with America, Japan was essentially planning to bite the hand that fed its entire military-industrial complex. But the real education, the insights that would make Yamamoto unique among Japanese military leaders, came during Harvard's summer breaks, when he would disappear for weeks at a time on unauthorized journeys across America. These expeditions were undertaken with minimal resources, often little more than a few dollars in his pocket, surviving on bread, bananas, and water, sleeping in fields and barns. Every penny saved was a penny that could extend his observations, allowing him to study American industrial capacity with a thoroughness that no other foreign observer had ever attempted. His first major expedition in the summer of 1920 took him to the oil fields of Texas, where he spent 3 weeks studying extraction methods and refinery operations with the dedication of an industrial spy. The scale of what he witnessed defied Japanese comprehension. Single oil wells in Texas produced more petroleum in a day than Japan imported in a week. The Texaco refinery at Port Arthur, which Yamamoto sketched and diagrammed in meticulous detail, processed 100,000 barrels daily more oil than most Japanese cities consumed in a year. The facility operated 24 hours a day, powered entirely by electricity, with automatic pumps and electric lighting that banished the darkness. To Yamamoto, accustomed to Japan's careful conservation of every precious drop of imported fuel, the casual abundance was almost overwhelming. He watched Americans burn off natural gas as waste gas that could have powered all of Tokyo for a month because it was more economical than capturing it. This wasn't just abundance. It was abundance so overwhelming that valuable resources were literally burned as inconveniences. "Oil is the blood of modern warfare," Yamamoto wrote in his journal during those sweltering Texas nights. "Ships, planes, tanks, trucks sold drink oil. America has oceans of it beneath their soil. Japan has none." This single fact determines everything. The mathematical certainty of Japan's disadvantage was becoming clearer with each derrick he observed, each refinery he studied, each conversation with American oil workers who spoke casually of reserves that seemed infinite. Summer 1920 brought Yamamoto's most revelatory experience, when he hitchhiked 900 miles from Cambridge to Detroit to observe what Henry Ford called the liberation of the common man. Standing outside the Ford Highland Park plant, watching the shift change as 20,000 workers streamed out to their private automobiles, Yamamoto witnessed something that would have been impossible in Japan. Industrial workers who owned cars, lived in their own homes, and enjoyed a standard of living that exceeded most Japanese officers. Inside the plant, which Yamamoto toured by claiming to be a visiting engineering student, he observed the assembly line that had revolutionized not just automobile manufacturing, but the entire concept of industrial production. A Model T Ford rolled off the line every 45 seconds, assembled by workers performing single, repetitive tasks with precision timing. The entire process, from raw steel to finished automobile, took just 93 minutes faster than most Japanese craftsmen could assemble a single complex component by hand. Yamamoto filled 3 notebooks during his week in Detroit, calculating figures that should have terrified any potential enemy of America. Ford alone employed more industrial workers than the entire Japanese Navy. The company's daily steel consumption exceeded Japan's weekly production. Most disturbing of all, this was just one company, in one city, in one industry. The sheer scale suggested an industrial capacity that could be scaled to military production almost without limit. "The Americans have made manufacturing into a science," he wrote to his mentor, Admiral Tomás Aburo. "They produce machines the way we produce rice, systematically, efficiently, in quantities that defy imagination. Each worker is a specialist. Each process is measured. Each improvement is incorporated immediately. There is no waste, no delay, no inefficiency. The implications for military production were obvious and terrifying. Assembly lines producing automobiles could just as easily produce military vehicles, tanks, aircraft engines, and weapons of war. The numbers Yamamoto collected painted a picture of industrial supremacy that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could overcome. American automobile production had grown from 485,000 vehicles in 1915 to 2.3 million in 1920. By the time of Yamamoto's visit, Americans owned one car for every 13 people. In Japan, the ratio was one car per 5,000 people. This wasn't just a difference in prosperity. It was a fundamental difference in industrial capacity that translated directly to military potential. Yamamoto's most extensive, unauthorized journey took him deep into the heart of American oil production during the summer of 1921, just before his Harvard graduation. He disappeared for 6 weeks, causing minor diplomatic concern when he missed several official functions, but he had gone to observe what he called the fountains of power, the oil fields that would determine the outcome of any future war. Traveling by freight train and on foot across the vast expanse of Texas, Yamamoto reached the legendary Spindletop Field near Beaumont, where the modern oil industry had been born with a massive gusher in 1901. Though past its peak production by 1921, the field still produced thousands of barrels daily from dozens of wells operating continuously. The scale of extraction was unlike anything in Japanese experience. Exhibient's individual wells produced more oil in a single day than Japan's largest refineries could process in a week. He traveled north to the newly discovered fields in Kilgore and Longview, experiencing the oil boom that would make East Texas the world's largest producing region. Oil derricks sprouted like a metallic forest, so densely packed that workers could walk from one drilling platform to another without touching the ground. The boom created instant cities where none had existed before, complete with electric lighting, telephone networks, and transportation systems that moved millions of barrels of oil with mechanical precision. The waste that accompanied this abundance particularly struck Yamamoto, accustomed as he was to Japan's careful conservation of every drop of imported fuel. Natural gas, considered a waste product, was burned off in flares that lit the night sky for miles around. The amount of energy wasted in a single evening could have powered Japanese cities for months. This casual treatment of valuable resources convinced Yamamoto more than any military demonstration that America possessed reserves so vast that normal considerations of scarcity simply did not apply. From the oil fields of Texas, Yamamoto's systematic study of American industrial capacity took him to the steel mills of Pennsylvania, where he witnessed the transformation of raw materials into the sinews of industrial war. The Bethlehem steel plant, which he observed in detail, operated electric furnaces that could produce specialized steel in hours that took Japanese foundries weeks to manufacture. The facility employed 30,000 workers and consumed more electricity than the entire city of Kyoto. But it was on just the scale that impressed Yamamoto. It was the integration and efficiency of the entire industrial system. He traced supply chains that brought iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range, coal from Pennsylvania fields, and limestone from Indiana quarries, all coordinated by telegraph and telephone networks to arrive at precisely the right moment for steel production. Materials moved thousands of miles with clockwork precision, managed by communications systems that Japan simply couldn't match. This integration extended beyond individual industries to encompass the entire American economy. The same transportation networks that moved oil from Texas could move coal from Pennsylvania. The same workers who assembled automobiles could build aircraft engines. The same steel that built skyscrapers could armor battleships. America had created not just individual industries, but an integrated industrial ecosystem capable of rapid conversion from civilian to military production. The insights Yamamoto gained during these years would prove tragically prophetic. But at the time, they made him an increasingly isolated voice within Japanese military circles. His warnings about American industrial capacity were dismissed. The mathematical reality he had observed was too uncomfortable for a military culture built on the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. In January 1926, Yamamoto returned to America as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, with the rank of captain and a posting that would last until March 1928. This official assignment gave him diplomatic status and a proper budget, allowing him to travel freely and observe American military capabilities with unprecedented access. What he discovered during this second American sojourn would confirm every fear his Harvard years had instilled and add new dimensions to his understanding of American power. American industrial production had not merely continued growing during his absence, it had exploded beyond even his pessimistic projections. Automobile manufacturing was heading toward 4.3 million vehicles by 1926. Steel production had reached 48 million tons annually. Oil production exceeded 770 million barrels per year. The numbers weren't just growing, they were accelerating at a rate that suggested American industrial capacity was entering an entirely new phase of development. Yamamoto established a routine of systematic observation that would have impressed any intelligence service. Monday through Wednesday, he fulfilled his official duties at the embassy, attending naval conferences, diplomatic receptions, and official functions. Thursday through Sunday, he traveled, always with the same laser focus: production capability, resource extraction, and technological advancement. His travels took him to facilities that most Americans never saw, industrial complexes that represented the cutting edge of manufacturing technology. At the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Pennsylvania, he observed the production of naval armor plate using techniques that Japanese industry couldn't match. The plant's electric furnaces could produce specialized alloys with precise chemical compositions, creating armor that was both lighter and stronger than anything Japan could manufacture. The integration of scientific research with industrial production was unlike anything in Japanese. Experienced metallurgists worked alongside engineers to continuously improve both materials and manufacturing processes. During his Washington posting, Yamamoto became famous among American military circles for hosting poker games every Friday night at his apartment. These weren't mere social occasions, but carefully orchestrated intelligence operations conducted over cards and whiskey. He invited American naval officers, diplomats, and intelligence officials, creating an atmosphere where information flowed as freely as the alcohol. Captain Ellis Zacharias of Naval Intelligence became a regular participant in these games. Decades later, Zacharias would reveal in his memoir that these Friday night sessions involved careful probing by both sides, with the players conducting subtle interrogations about naval doctrine, ship capabilities, and strategic thinking while maintaining the veneer of friendly competition. Yamamoto was brilliant at poker, Zacharias recalled. He could remember every card played, calculate odds instantly, and read faces like books. But more importantly, he used the games to understand American psychology. He wanted to know how Americans thought, how they made decisions, how they reacted to pressure. The poker games revealed something crucial about American character that would prove decisive in any future conflict. Americans were risk-takers who could afford to lose because they had deep reserves to draw upon. This mentality, Yamamoto realized, reflected their national strategy perfectly. America could lose battles, even entire campaigns, and continue fighting because their industrial base could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. Japan, with its limited resources and industrial capacity, could not afford a single major defeat. One evening in February 1926, after winning a substantial pot, Yamamoto made a comment that Zacharias never forgot. In poker and war, the player with the most chips can afford to wait for the right cards. Japan is playing with borrowed chips against a player who owns the bank. Yamamoto's greatest strategic insight during his American years concerned aviation, the military technology that he alone, among Japanese leaders, understood would determine future naval warfare. While most naval officers on both sides of the Pacific still thought in terms of battleship duels and surface engagements, Yamamoto grasped that aircraft would revolutionize naval combat, and America was perfectly positioned to dominate this new dimension of warfare. His visit to the Glenn L. Martin Company in Cleveland, Ohio, revealed aircraft manufacturing using automobile-style assembly techniques that could produce complex military aircraft with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Workers who had never seen an airplane before training could build sophisticated military aircraft in weeks rather than the months required by traditional craftsman methods. The factory produced 6 planes daily using electric tools, powered conveyors, and specialized jigs that ensured perfect assembly tolerances. At McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, the predecessor to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Yamamoto observed American aviation research that was decades ahead of anything in Japan. The facility employed more aeronautical engineers than existed in all of Japan combined. They had wind tunnels for testing aircraft designs, engine test facilities for developing more powerful propulsion systems, and materials laboratories that were creating lighter, stronger aircraft components using scientific methods that Japanese industry couldn't match. The statistics told a story of American aviation dominance that was already overwhelming and accelerating rapidly. In 1926, American aircraft manufacturers produced 1,186 military aircraft and 5,789 civilian planes. American airlines were already carrying mail and passengers on regular schedules across the continent, creating a civilian aviation infrastructure that could support military operations. Japan struggled to produce 200 aircraft annually, mostly using imported engines and instruments purchased from the very nation they were planning to fight. The Americans think in 3 dimensions, Yamamoto wrote in a confidential report to Tokyo that was largely ignored by his superiors. While we perfect our battleships for surface combat, they are building the infrastructure for aerial warfare. They have the aluminum production, the engine technology, and most importantly, the production capacity to build aircraft by the thousands. His warnings fell on deaf ears. The Japanese Navy remained focused on battleships and the decisive surface engagement that Yamamoto knew would never come. Yamamoto's most comprehensive tour of American industrial capacity came during the summer of 1926, when he used his diplomatic status and carefully cultivated connections to arrange visits to facilities that most foreigners never saw. Each visit added crucial data points to his growing calculation of American invincibility, building a mathematical case for Japanese defeat that was overwhelming in its thoroughness and precision. At the River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, Yamamoto observed the full integration of American manufacturing power in a facility that was essentially a city unto itself, covering 2,000 acres. The complex received iron ore by ship from the Great Lakes, coal by train from Pennsylvania mines, and rubber from Firestone plantations in Liberia. Everything from steel smelting to final automobile assembly happened on the same site, eliminating transportation costs and coordination delays. The complex employed 100,000 workers, more than the entire Japanese Navy, and generated 400,000 horsepower of electricity from its own power plant. The scale overwhelmed even Yamamoto's careful preparations. Blast furnaces stories tall operated continuously, feeding molten steel to rolling mills that produced sheet metal in precisely calculated thicknesses. Assembly lines stretched for miles through buildings large enough to house entire Japanese cities. The integration extended to every aspect of production. The same furnaces that melted iron ore could produce steel for military vehicles. The same assembly lines that built civilian automobiles could manufacture tanks and aircraft engines. The same transportation network that delivered raw materials could distribute military equipment. America had created not just manufacturing capacity, but a unified industrial organism capable of total mobilization for war production. Standing in the River Rouge parking lots, which held 25,000 workers, automobiles more cars than existed in most Japanese cities. Yamamoto finally grasped the full magnitude of what Japan was contemplating. This wasn't just industrial capacity. It was an entirely different civilization built upon abundance rather than scarcity, mass production rather than individual craftsmanship, scientific management rather than traditional methods. His final major observation during this period came at Standard Oil's Bayway refinery in New Jersey, where he witnessed petroleum refining on an industrial scale that dwarfed anything in Japanese experience. The facility processed 100,000 barrels daily, producing not just fuel, but hundreds of petroleum products, from lubricants to chemicals used in explosives manufacturing. The catalytic cracking towers, invented just years earlier, could extract twice as much gasoline from crude oil as Japanese refineries using older distillation methods. They have solved the equation of modern war, Yamamoto noted in his private journal. Unlimited raw materials plus unlimited production capacity plus unlimited innovation equals inevitable victory. Japan has none of these advantages. The mathematical conclusion was inescapable. Japan could achieve tactical victories through superior training and fighting spirit. But strategic victory was mathematically impossible against such overwhelming industrial superiority. As Yamamoto prepared to return to Japan in March 1928, he spent his final weeks in America compiling a comprehensive assessment that would prove to be one of the most accurate intelligence documents in military history. His 200-page report on American capabilities should have ended any thought of war between the two nations. But it would instead be filed away and largely ignored by leaders who preferred comfortable illusions to uncomfortable facts. The report's conclusions were stark and uncompromising. American manufacturing exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10 to 20 in every critical category. American oil production was 100 times Japan's total consumption. American steel production was 12 times greater than Japan's entire output. American automobile production demonstrated mass production capabilities that could be instantly converted to military use. American aviation was advancing so rapidly that Japan could never hope to catch up through conventional development. But perhaps most importantly, Yamamoto had identified the fundamental difference between the two industrial systems. America had created a culture of innovation and improvement that generated continuous advancement in manufacturing methods, materials, science, and production efficiency. Japan's industrial system, built on imported technology and traditional hierarchies, could not match this dynamism even with unlimited resources. Returning to Japan with this devastating knowledge, Yamamoto found himself increasingly isolated within military circles that had no interest in hearing uncomfortable truths. His American experience, rather than being valued as crucial intelligence, made him suspect among colleagues who whispered that he had become too Americanized, too contaminated by foreign influence to properly serve the emperor. His habits drinking coffee instead of tea, smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes, reading American magazines, marked him as somehow tainted by his years abroad. His warnings about American industrial capacity were dismissed as defeatist thinking or foreign propaganda. The mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat that he had calculated so precisely was simply too uncomfortable for a military culture built on the mythology of spiritual superiority over material advantage. But Yamamoto persisted in his warnings, lecture after lecture, article after article, hammering home the same unwelcome message. Japan could not defeat America in a prolonged war. The industrial disparity was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. America had created a system of innovation and production that improved continuously, while Japan's limited resources and rigid social structures could not match this dynamism, no matter how heroically individual soldiers fought. The stage was being set for one of history's greatest tragedies. A nation marching toward a war that its most knowledgeable military leader knew was unwinnable, led by men who preferred mythology to mathematics, spiritual beliefs to statistical reality. Yamamoto's American education had given him perfect foresight into Japan's future, but in the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Japan, Foresight without political power was merely prophesied, precise, and utterly ignored. As the 1930s progressed and Japan became increasingly militaristic and expansionist, Yamamoto's opposition to war with America made him a marked man. Ultranationalist army officers who had already assassinated moderate politicians now focused their attention on the admiral who insisted Japan could win a war against the United States. The threat became so serious that Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yoni, who shared Yamamoto's realistic assessment of American power, made the decision to transfer him to sea duty as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The appointment, announced on August 30, 1939, coincidentally the same day Germany invaded Poland, was explicitly designed to save Yamamoto's life. At sea, commanding the fleet from his flagship, he would be safe from army extremists who viewed his warnings as treasonous defeatism. The irony was bitter and complete. The man most opposed to war with America was given command of the very force that would have to fight that war. Yamamoto understood the cruel logic behind his appointment. If war came by 1939, it seemed increasingly inevitable. Japan would need its most capable strategist commanding the fleet, even if that strategist believed the war was fundamentally unwinnable. It was a position of supreme responsibility, coupled with complete powerlessness, requiring him to prepare for a conflict he knew would end in Japan's destruction. "I have been given command of the combined fleet," he wrote to his longtime friend, Admiral Yoshida. "It is like being asked to perform surgery on a patient who insists on committing suicide. I can perhaps delay the agony, but I cannot prevent the death." The medical metaphor was particularly apt. Yamamoto had diagnosed Japan's condition with scientific precision, but the patient refused treatment and insisted on pursuing the very course of action that would prove fatal. His opposition to war never wavered, even as his own government moved inexorably toward the conflict he dreaded. In September 1940, when the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy was being debated, Yamamoto warned that the alliance would lead inevitably to war with America. The pact would force Japan to choose between abandoning its European allies or fighting a global war against industrial powers that collectively outproduced Japan by ratios that made victory mathematically impossible. To Prince Kano, who had asked the original question about Japan's chances in September 1940, Yamamoto was characteristically blunt. "If we fight the Americans, I can give you 1 year. After that, I guarantee nothing." The prince, caught between army pressure for war and Navy warnings about defeat, chose to believe that somehow Japanese spirit would overcome American material, a decision that would cost millions of lives and end in Japan's complete destruction. To Navy Minister Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, in October 1940, Yamamoto was even more specific about the timeline he had calculated. "If I am ordered to fight, I shall do my best for 6 months. I shall run wild considerably for the first half year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." These were uncasual estimates, but precise calculations based on his detailed knowledge of American industrial capacity and the time required for that capacity to fully mobilize for war production. The supreme irony of Yamamoto's career reached its peak in January 1941, when he began planning the Pearl Harbor attack. The man who knew Japan couldn't win was tasked with finding a way to win anyway. His solution was based entirely on his intimate knowledge of American psychology and industrial capacity gained during his years in America. The attack plan represented both strategic brilliance and strategic desperation, a perfectly executed tactical operation designed to achieve an impossible strategic objective. Yamamoto understood that America's greatest weakness was psychological rather than material. Americans, secure in their continental fortress and protected by 2 vast oceans, didn't expect direct attack on their homeland. Their very strength bred a kind of complacency that made them vulnerable to psychological shock. A devastating surprise attack might convince them that fighting Japan would be too costly, leading to negotiations before American industrial might could fully mobilize. The plan was desperate because the strategic situation was desperate. Japan needed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with operations in Southeast Asia, where Japan hoped to capture the oil and raw materials necessary for continuing the war. More crucially, Japan needed to convince America that the cost of victory would be too high to justify, leading to a negotiated peace that would allow Japan to keep its conquests. But even as he planned the attack with meticulous care, Yamamoto knew it would ultimately fail. Not the tactical attack itself, he was confident his superbly trained pilots could devastate Pearl Harbor and cripple the American Pacific Fleet. The failure would come in the strategic aftermath, when America's manufacturing power turned from civilian production to weapons of war. He had observed the factories that would produce those weapons, calculated the oil that would fuel the counterattack, experienced the mass production techniques that would build fleets of ships and aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The Pearl Harbor attack would succeed tactically and fail strategically, exactly as Yamamoto predicted with the mathematical precision of an engineer. American industrial capacity, once aroused to war production, would overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer weight of materiel. The same assembly lines that built automobiles would produce tanks and aircraft. The same oil fields that fueled civilian transportation would power military operations. The same steel mills that built skyscrapers would armor battleships and aircraft carriers. As 1941 progressed and war became inevitable, despite all diplomatic efforts, Yamamoto's warnings grew more desperate and specific. To his staff officers, who continued celebrating Japan's military prowess and certain victory, he provided sobering mathematical realities that should have ended all illusions about Japanese chances. America has 500,000 tons of oil in reserve for every ton Japan possesses. They produce 500 times more steel than we do. Their factories can retool in weeks to produce weapons of war. We have already lost this war. We simply haven't started fighting it yet. The mathematics were indeed overwhelming and indisputable. Japan's entire oil reserve accumulated through years of careful conservation and strategic stockpiling amounted to perhaps 50 million barrels. America produced that much oil in less than 3 weeks of normal production. Japan's total steel production in a year equaled what American mills produced in a single month. The industrial equations that would determine the war's outcome had been calculated with slide rules and logarithm tables, but the results were as certain as any mathematical proof. In September 1941, addressing the graduation class at his old school in Nagaka, Yamamoto delivered perhaps his most poignant and prophetic warning to the next generation of Japanese leaders. Most people think Americans love luxury and that their culture is shallow and meaningless. It is a mistake to regard the Americans as luxury-loving and weak. I can tell you that they are full of spirit, adventure, and fight. Their thinking is scientific and well advanced. He continued with an example that perfectly captured American character. Lindbergh's solo crossing of the Atlantic is the sort of valiant act which is normal for them. Do not forget that American industry is much more developed than ours, and unlike us, they have all the oil they want. Japan cannot beat America. Therefore, Japan should not fight America. The young graduates sat in stunned silence, hearing one of Japan's most celebrated naval leaders tell them their country was preparing to lose a war it seemed determined to start. To his mistress, Chiyoko Kawai Yamamoto was even more direct in his letters, expressing the frustration of a man who could see the future with perfect clarity but was powerless to change it. The government has been lying to the people. They speak of America as weak and divided. I have been there. I have observed their strength firsthand. We are insects declaring war on a dragon. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded beyond even Yamamoto's most optimistic projections. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and 2,403 Americans were killed in the surprise assault. The combined fleet's losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men killed. Across Japan, crowds celebrated in the streets as news of the victory spread. The emperor's announcement of war was greeted with banzai cheers and patriotic demonstrations. Finally, Japan had shown the arrogant Americans their proper place in the new Asian order. Aboard his flagship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, Yamamoto received the operational reports in silence, while his staff prepared to celebrate with sake and traditional toasts to the emperor. Instead, he retired to his private cabin, leaving his officers bewildered by his apparent lack of enthusiasm for the great victory. Chief of Staff Admiral Matome Ugaki found him hours later, staring at charts of the Pacific Ocean with the expression of a man contemplating an impossible task. Years later, Hollywood movies would put famous words in Yamamoto's mouth about awakening a sleeping giant, a phrase he never actually spoke. His real documented reaction, recorded by Admiral Ugaki, was more precise and less poetic. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. The failure to destroy the American aircraft carriers concerned Yamamoto, but not as much as the failure to destroy the oil storage tanks and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor. His intimate knowledge of American ports, gained during his years as naval attaché, told him how quickly Americans could rebuild what appeared to be devastating damage. The attack had looked spectacular and complete, but was actually superficial impressive pyrotechnics that left America's fundamental naval infrastructure intact. More troubling was the diplomatic failure that made the attack appear to be a treacherous sneak attack rather than a legitimate military operation. Yamamoto had insisted that the assault follow a formal declaration of war, but Japanese embassy bungling in Washington had prevented the declaration from being delivered before the attack began. Americans would now see Pearl Harbor as an act of treachery, ensuring that no negotiated peace would be possible. The psychological shock that might have led to compromise had instead generated righteous fury that would sustain American war efforts through years of sacrifice. I had hoped to fight a war of honor, Yamamoto told Admiral Ugaki in the privacy of his cabin. Instead, we have guaranteed our own destruction through dishonor. The Americans will never negotiate now. They will fight until we are completely defeated, and their industrial capacity ensures they will succeed. Exactly as Yamamoto had predicted with mathematical precision, Japan ran wild for the first 6 months following Pearl Harbor. The combined fleet swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, crushing Allied forces with stunning efficiency and tactical brilliance. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress in Asia, fell after a lightning campaign that humiliated European colonial powers. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino forces, succumbed after desperate resistance that ended with the tragic Bataan Death March. The Dutch East Indies, with their crucial oil resources, fell to Japanese forces who seemed to achieve the impossible with every operation. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, encompassing territories that contained hundreds of millions of people and vast natural resources. Japanese forces had achieved in 6 months what European colonial powers had taken centuries to accomplish. Military academies around the world would study these campaigns for decades as examples of perfect coordination, tactical innovation, and strategic audacity. But Yamamoto took no joy in these spectacular victories. Alone among Japanese leaders, he understood that they were illusions made possible only because America had not yet fully mobilized its industrial capacity for war production. In his private cabin aboard the Yamato, he kept detailed charts showing American ship construction schedules, aircraft production figures, and industrial mobilization statistics. The numbers were terrifying in their inexorable mathematical certainty. In the first 6 months of 1942, while Japan celebrated its string of victories, American shipyards had launched 2 fleet aircraft carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, 23 destroyers, and 26 submarines. This was merely the beginning, the first trickle of production from factories that were still retooling from civilian to military production. Yamamoto knew from his visits to American shipyards during the 1920s that they were operating at perhaps 20% of their potential capacity. When fully operational, those same shipyards would produce vessels faster than Japan could possibly sink them. The Kaiser shipyards alone, using revolutionary prefabrication techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing, would eventually launch a Liberty ship every day. Japan's entire naval construction program could unmatch the output of a single American shipbuilding complex operating at full capacity. The oil situation was even more desperate than Yamamoto had calculated in his most pessimistic assessments. Despite capturing the Dutch East Indies, oil fields Japan's primary strategic objective in Southeast Asia, Japanese petroleum production still could unmatch American output by orders of magnitude. America produced more oil in a single month than Japan's captured territories could produce in an entire year. Even more critically, American synthetic rubber production meant they didn't need Asian rubber plantations, while Japan remained vulnerable to the submarine warfare that would eventually strangle its maritime supply lines. We are children who have stolen candy while the adult prepares his punishment, Yamamoto told his operations officer during a planning conference in early 1942. We celebrate our temporary success while failing to understand that we have made our ultimate defeat inevitable through our very victories. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. Almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the precise moment when Yamamoto's prophecy about Japan's brief period of success would be fulfilled with mathematical exactitude. The battle plan was complex, perhaps overly complex, reflecting Yamamoto's growing desperation as he understood this might represent Japan's last realistic chance to destroy American aircraft carriers before overwhelming reinforcements arrived from American shipyards. Intelligence reports suggested that America had at most 2 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific, making this the perfect moment for a decisive engagement that might eliminate American naval power in the Pacific for months or even years. In reality, American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz perfect knowledge of Japanese plans while concealing the true strength of American forces in the area. The disaster that unfolded at Midway had the terrible inevitability that Yamamoto had long foreseen. For Japanese aircraft carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk in a single day of combat, along with their irreplaceable complement of veteran pilots who had participated in Pearl Harbor and every major operation since. These losses represented not just tactical defeat but strategic catastrophe. Japan lacked both the industrial capacity and the trained personnel to recover from such devastating losses. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind the carrier force as part of the main battle fleet, Yamamoto received the reports of disaster with the composure of a man who had long expected this moment. When informed that all 4 carriers were lost, along with most of their aircraft and pilots, he simply nodded with what witnesses described as almost relief, as if a long-expected burden had finally arrived. The American giant is now fully awake, he told his staff officers, who were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat. From this moment forward, we fight only to delay the inevitable. His words proved prophetic with mathematical precision. In the 18 months following Midway, America would launch 17 fleet aircraft carriers and 76 escort carriers, while Japan would complete only 6 carriers total. The industrial equation that Yamamoto had calculated at Harvard University was playing out exactly as he had predicted 20 years earlier. After Midway, American war production reached levels that would have seemed fantastical even to Yamamoto's pessimistic calculations. The industrial colossus had not merely awakened it, had transformed into a force of nature that operated beyond normal human comprehension. By 1943, American factories were producing aircraft at the rate of 1 every 5 minutes, merchant ships at 1 per day, aircraft carriers at 1 per month. The Ford Willow Run plant alone which hadn't existed when Yamamoto visited Detroit in the 1920s, was manufacturing B-2 for Liberator bombers at the rate of one every 63 minutes. The entire Willow Run facility had been designed and constructed in 9 months, faster than Japan could build a single comparable factory even with unlimited resources and no enemy interference. American industrial capacity had achieved a scale and speed that defied traditional military planning. They weren't just outproducing Japan. They were operating in an entirely different dimension of manufacturing capability that made conventional strategic calculations obsolete. Yamamoto received these intelligence reports with the grim satisfaction of a prophet whose warnings had been vindicated, even though that vindication meant his nation's destruction. Everything he had predicted during the 1930s was coming true, only faster and more overwhelmingly than even his pessimistic projections had suggested. The assembly lines he had studied in Detroit were now producing the instruments of Japan's defeat. The oil fields he had observed in Texas were fueling the fleets that dominated the Pacific. The integration of American industry he had witnessed was enabling total mobilization for war production at a scale that no other nation could match. Through 1942 and early 1943, Yamamoto commanded the combined fleet with the full knowledge of inevitable defeat. A burden that his closest associates noticed was taking an increasingly heavy psychological toll. His letters to Chiyoko Kawai, discovered after the war, reveal a man haunted by his accurate foresight. "I am like a doctor treating a patient I have already diagnosed as terminal. I can ease some symptoms, delay the final moment, but I cannot change the outcome. The disease is industrial inferiority, and it is absolutely fatal." His staff officers noticed increasing fatalism in Yamamoto's behavior, as if he were deliberately exposing himself to danger unnecessarily. During inspection tours of forward bases, he insisted on visiting the most dangerous positions, flying invulnerable aircraft over areas where American fighters might intercept him. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his private diary, "The commander-in-chief seems to welcome danger. He understands something we refuse to acknowledge, that we have already lost this war. His burden is not merely command of the fleet, but the weight of prophecy fulfilled." Yamamoto's final strategic assessment, written in March 1943, was characteristically stark and mathematical. "America has replaced every ship lost at Pearl Harbor twice over. They have trained more pilots in 1 year than Japan has trained in 20. Their production increases monthly, while ours declines from resource shortages and bombing attacks. Mathematics, not courage, determines victory in modern warfare. The mathematics doom us, absolutely." American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's travel itinerary on April 14, 1943, revealing that he would be inspecting forward bases in the Solomon Islands, flying from Rabaul to Balal Island on April 18 in a precisely scheduled flight that was typical of his attention to detail and punctuality. The decision to assassinate him was approved at the highest levels of American command, with Admiral Chester Nimitz asking whether such an operation was worth revealing American code-breaking capabilities to the enemy. The answer was unequivocally yes. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, not merely as a tactical commander, but as the only Japanese military leader who truly understood American industrial capabilities and could potentially devise strategies to delay Japan's inevitable defeat. His death would remove the last Japanese leader capable of realistic strategic planning based on actual rather than wishful assessments of relative national power. Operation Vengeance dispatched 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Guadalcanal, flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection on a mission requiring precise navigation over 435 miles of open ocean. The fighters had to arrive at the exact minute Yamamoto's aircraft would be approaching Bougainville, a feat of navigation. And timing that itself demonstrated the technological superiority Yamamoto had warned would prove decisive. The technology that killed Yamamoto embodied everything he had observed and feared about American industrial capacity. The P-38 Lightning fighters were products of mass production techniques he had witnessed in Detroit. powered by Allison engines, producing 1,600 horsepower each, and burning high-octane aviation fuel refined from Texas crude oil. Their navigation equipment was more precise than anything Japan could manufacture. Their timing was perfect, and their execution was flawless. At 9:34 a.m. on April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M bomber was shot down over the jungle of Bougainville Island. The man who had experienced American manufacturing power firsthand was killed by its product's advanced fighter aircraft, guided by code-breaking technology that Japan could unmatch, flown by pilots trained using systematic methods that produced competent aviators in months rather than years. His body was found the following day, still strapped to his seat, with his hand resting on his ceremonial sword. In his coat pocket, searchers discovered a poem he had written just days before his final flight. "I have seen the future, and it belongs to those who build, not those who destroy." The words captured the essential tragedy of his position, a man who understood that Japan's path led to destruction but was powerless to change that course. Yamamoto's death removed the one Japanese leader who truly comprehended the hopelessness of Japan's strategic situation. His replacement, Admiral Manechi Koga, lacked both Yamamoto's strategic vision and his first-hand knowledge of American capabilities. Without Yamamoto's realistic assessments, Japanese leadership became even more divorced from mathematical reality, prolonging a war that was already mathematically unwinnable and ensuring even greater destruction for Japan. The prophecy Yamamoto had made in September 1946, months to a year of victories followed by inevitable defeat, proved accurate with the precision of a mathematical theorem. Every prediction he had, based on his American observations, materialized exactly as calculated. American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer weight of materiel. American oil resources proved effectively unlimited, while Japan's supplies dwindled toward zero. American technological advantages, particularly in radar and communications, provided decisive tactical benefits that Japanese fighting spirit couldn't overcome. American mass production techniques enabled rapid replacement of combat losses at rates that made Japanese victories strategically meaningless. Most importantly, American industrial conversion from civilian to military production exceeded even Yamamoto's most pessimistic warnings. By 1944, the United States was producing more military equipment in a single month than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. The factories Yamamoto had visited during the 1920s were now operating at levels that defied comprehension. The River Rouge plant alone produced more military vehicles than all Japanese factories combined. The oil fields of Texas were fueling not just American operations but also supplying Allied forces around the globe. The integration of American industry that had impressed him 20 years earlier now enabled unprecedented coordination of global warfare across multiple theaters simultaneously. After Midway, American war production reached levels that would have seemed fantastical even to Yamamoto's pessimistic calculations. The industrial colossus had not merely awakened it, had transformed into a force of nature that operated beyond normal human comprehension. By 1943, American factories were producing aircraft at the rate of one every 5 minutes, merchant ships at one per day, aircraft carriers at one per month. The Ford Willow Run plant alone, which hadn't existed when Yamamoto visited Detroit in the 1920s, was manufacturing B-2 for Liberator bombers at the rate of one every 63 minutes. The entire Willow Run facility had been designed and constructed in 9 months, faster than Japan could build a single comparable factory even with unlimited resources and no enemy interference. American industrial capacity had achieved a scale and speed that defied traditional military planning. They weren't just outproducing Japan. They were operating in an entirely different dimension of manufacturing capability that made conventional strategic calculations obsolete. Yamamoto received these intelligence reports with the grim satisfaction of a prophet whose warnings had been vindicated, even though that vindication meant his nation's destruction. Everything he had predicted during the 1930s was coming true. only faster and more overwhelmingly than even his pessimistic projections had suggested. The assembly lines he had studied in Detroit were now producing the instruments of Japan's defeat. The oil fields he had observed in Texas were fueling the fleets that dominated the Pacific. The integration of American industry he had witnessed was enabling total mobilization for war production at a scale that no other nation could match. Through 1942 and early 1943, Yamamoto commanded the combined fleet with the full knowledge of inevitable defeat. A burden that his closest associates noticed was taking an increasingly heavy psychological toll. His letters to Chiyoko Kawai, discovered after the war, reveal a man haunted by his accurate foresight. "I am like a doctor treating a patient I have already diagnosed as terminal. I can ease some symptoms, delay the final moment, but I cannot change the outcome. The disease is industrial inferiority, and it is absolutely fatal." His staff officers noticed increasing fatalism in Yamamoto's behavior, as if he were deliberately exposing himself to danger unnecessarily. During inspection tours of forward bases, he insisted on visiting the most dangerous positions, flying in vulnerable aircraft over areas where American fighters might intercept him. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his private diary, "The commander-in-chief seems to welcome danger. He understands something we refuse to acknowledge, that we have already lost this war. His burden is not merely command of the fleet, but the weight of prophecy fulfilled." Yamamoto's final strategic assessment, written in March 1943, was characteristically stark and mathematical. "America has replaced every ship lost at Pearl Harbor twice over. They have trained more pilots in 1 year than Japan has trained in 20. Their production increases monthly, while ours declines from resource shortages and bombing attacks. Mathematics, not courage, determines victory in modern warfare. The mathematics doom us, absolutely." American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's travel itinerary on April 14, 1943, revealing that he would be inspecting forward bases in the Solomon Islands, flying from Rabaul to Balal Island on April 18 in a precisely scheduled flight that was typical of his attention to detail and punctuality. The decision to assassinate him was approved at the highest levels of American command, with Admiral Chester Nimitz asking whether such an operation was worth revealing American code-breaking capabilities to the enemy. The answer was unequivocally yes. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, not merely as a tactical commander, but as the only Japanese military leader who truly understood American industrial capabilities and could potentially devise strategies to delay Japan's inevitable defeat. His death would remove the last Japanese leader capable of realistic strategic planning based on actual rather than wishful assessments of relative national power. Operation Vengeance dispatched 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Guadalcanal, flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection on a mission requiring precise navigation over 435 miles of open ocean. The fighters had to arrive at the exact minute Yamamoto's aircraft would be approaching Bougainville, a feat of navigation. And timing that itself demonstrated the technological superiority Yamamoto had warned would prove decisive. The technology that killed Yamamoto embodied everything he had observed and feared about American industrial capacity. The P-38 Lightning fighters were products of mass production techniques he had witnessed in Detroit. Powered by Allison engines producing 1,600 horsepower each and burning high-octane aviation fuel refined from Texas crude oil, their navigation equipment was more precise than anything Japan could manufacture. Their timing was perfect, and their execution was flawless. At 9:34 a.m. on April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M bomber was shot down over the jungle of Bougainville Island. The man who had experienced American manufacturing power firsthand was killed by its product's advanced fighter aircraft, guided by code-breaking technology that Japan could unmatch, flown by pilots trained using systematic methods that produced competent aviators in months rather than years. His body was found the following day, still strapped to his seat, with his hand resting on his ceremonial sword. In his coat pocket, searchers discovered a poem he had written just days before his final flight. "I have seen the future, and it belongs to those who build, not those who destroy." The words captured the essential tragedy of his position, a man who understood that Japan's path led to destruction but was powerless to change that course. Yamamoto's death removed the one Japanese leader who truly comprehended the hopelessness of Japan's strategic situation. His replacement, Admiral Manechi Koga, lacked both Yamamoto's strategic vision and his first-hand knowledge of American capabilities. Without Yamamoto's realistic assessments, Japanese leadership became even more divorced from mathematical reality, prolonging a war that was already mathematically unwinnable and ensuring even greater destruction for Japan. The prophecy Yamamoto had made in September 1946, months to a year of victories followed by inevitable defeat, proved accurate with the precision of a mathematical theorem. Every prediction he had, based on his American observations, materialized exactly as calculated. American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer weight of materiel. American oil resources proved effectively unlimited, while Japan's supplies dwindled toward zero. American technological advantages, particularly in radar and communications, provided decisive tactical benefits that Japanese fighting spirit couldn't overcome. American mass production techniques enabled rapid replacement of combat losses at rates that made Japanese victories strategically meaningless. Most importantly, American industrial conversion from civilian to military production exceeded even Yamamoto's most pessimistic warnings. By 1944, the United States was producing more military equipment in a single month than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. The factories Yamamoto had visited during the 1920s were now operating at levels that defied comprehension. The River Rouge plant alone produced more military vehicles than all Japanese factories combined. The oil fields of Texas were fueling not just American operations but also supplying Allied forces around the globe. The integration of American industry that had impressed him 20 years earlier now enabled unprecedented coordination of global warfare across multiple theaters simultaneously.